We do praise thee forever, for on the holy cross hast thou the world from sin redeemed. Christ, we do all adore thee, and we do praise thee forever. Christ, we do all adore thee. How do you explain? How do you describe a love that goes from east to west and runs as deep as it is wide? You know all our hopes, Lord, you know all our fears, and words cannot express the love we feel, but we long for you to hear. So listen to our hearts, hear our spirit sing, a song of praise that flows from those you have redeemed. We will use the words we know to tell you what an awesome God you are. But words are not enough to tell you of our love, so listen to our heart. If words could fall like rain from these lips of mine, and if I had 1,000 years, Lord, I would still run out of time. If you listen to my heart, every beat will say, thank you for the life, thank you for the truth, and thank you for the way. So listen to our hearts, hear our spirit sing, a song of praise that flows from those you have redeemed. We will use the words we know to tell you what an awesome God you are. But words are not enough to tell you of our love, so listen to our hearts. You can be seated.
I'll be reading Esther chapter 3, verse 5 through 6. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor, he was enraged. Yet having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes.
Good morning, everybody. Howdy. If you're visiting, I'm glad you're with us. Please know that we have and it'll be announced later, but we have a meal after. In light of that, I don't know why this sermon can't be 10 minutes. I also have no reason this sermon can't be 45. So maybe we'll find somewhere in between. Yeah, that's right. Okay. Not a moment above 43. Everybody turn to Esther, please. Turn to the book of Esther. There we go. We'll get there. And while you're turning there, I want you to think about what you know about the book. And if that's not a whole lot, that's okay. But if you do know a little something about Esther, you'll know that God's name is never mentioned explicitly in the book. It makes me think about a few things. One of the things that we struggle with is to know that, and I mean to know that God is always working. Scripture tells us over and over, always working. It sets up moments where you can question, is he? Maybe. I don't see it. But then it concludes this, that he is working. I want to show you a few of those. One is actually by the great big period that's not in Scripture at all, between Malachi and Matthew, around 400 years. Some people call the silent period, because there's no explicit prophecy that's written down for us. What happened in those 400 years? God wasn't doing anything. Just all of a sudden, Matthew writes something down. That's how it happened. But then as you look at how history actually unfolds, it couldn't be further from the truth that God was doing something in those 400 years. In those 400 years, for an example, you find that in the Old Testament, what were the Jews speaking? What language? Hebrew. What's your Old Testament written in? Hebrew and a little bit of Aramaic, which is kind of like Hebrew. And then you get to the New Testament, and what are a lot of the Jews speaking? Greek. What are our New Testaments written in? Do you ever scratch your head and say, how did that happen? How are they writing in this common Greek language? And the idea that I think of is that, well, not all the world spoke Hebrew, and God was about to give them a universal message. And so he uses Alexander the Great, goes through and conquers the world, but guess what he leaves behind? His empire doesn't stay. It lasts a couple years. He dies when he's 33. Then they fight over it and it splits up. But guess what's left behind? The Greek language. There's a universal language, and guess what? Our Gospels are written in that universal language. And then you have the Romans come through. Now, the Romans actually are persecuting the Jews in the first few centuries. But what they did have was called the Pax Romana, or Roman peace. It's just funner to say Pax Romana because then you can pretend you know some Latin or something. The Pax Romana. Say it in your heads. It's fun. Okay. But Roman peace. And the idea is that there was this empire, there was this diversity, but the Jews were allowed to practice their religion. The Christians were allowed to practice their religion. And along with that, with this great big empire with lots of peace, guess what there was? Roads to everywhere. And guess who uses those roads all through the New Testament? Paul. As he goes through, and he uses his rights as a Roman citizen in Acts. Or think about this. This is really interesting. In the New Testament, where's the common place the Jews met? They had the temple, and they also had, yeah, you said it, synagogues. Guess how many synagogues there are in the Old Testament? 0 synagogues? Where did those come from? Because the synagogues were a result of the persecution, because there were Jews spread everywhere and they still wanted to get together. They couldn't go to the temple, so they had these synagogues. Right? God never asked them to build the synagogues in the Old Testament. It's a reflection of their circumstances, of where they were. But then God uses the synagogues, because nearly every one of the first churches that were planted in the places that Paul went to let them know about the fulfillment of their scriptures were synagogues. All that is to be a long example to say, are you telling me that God was doing nothing for those 400 years? Or there's a whole lot that God was doing that you don't see until Matthew? When you read John's gospel, Jesus says this. Actually, let's go turn there. John chapter 5. Hold your spot, Esther. I promise we'll get back. John chapter 5. My fingers are slow. So the Jews were saying to the man who is cured, it is Sabbath, and it is not permissible for you to carry your pallet. But he answered them and said, he who made me well was the one who said, pick up your pallet and walk. They asked him, "Who is the man who said to you, 'Pick up your pallet and walk'?" But the man who was healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had slipped away while there was a crowd in that place. Afterward, Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, "Behold, you have become well. Do not sin anymore, so that nothing worse happens to you." The man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who made him well. For this reason, the Jews were persecuting Jesus because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. Now, we often go to this text, when we're studying through John or when we're talking about kind of the legalistic view of the law. This idea that Jesus gives them is that it is okay to heal on the Sabbath. It's a text that's primarily about the Sabbath, but we often skip over this verse that this section ends with. But he answered them, "My Father is working until now, and I myself am working." What does Jesus say? God is working. When is God working? Yes. God is working now. God is working on Monday. God is working on Tuesday. God is even working on the Sabbath to bring about his plans for us. Now, more recently to our series, and to kind of get back towards Esther, we recently studied through Ezra and Nehemiah. And what Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther all have in common is that they're all during the periods of captivity. The periods that you would expect God to be silent. The periods that feel like punishment. Yet in each one, it's very clear that God is up to something. Because when you read Ezra chapter 1, it says God stirred the heart of Cyrus, the Gentile king. When you read Nehemiah chapter 2 and verse 8, Nehemiah seems to think that God placed it in his heart and goes and talks to King, bear with me with all these names, Artaxerxes. Okay. I think of also in this idea of 1 Samuel chapter 3, the word of the Lord was rare in those days. It was so strange to Samuel when God talked to him because the word of the Lord was rare. The point being to all this is that God is sometimes quiet, but he's never not working. Always working all throughout Scripture to bring us to a very important place, a very important point. Now, we can cite some Scripture and say God is always working, and we can accept it. But then the thing that we struggle with is how God chooses to work. We struggle with that at times, and so did the people throughout Scripture. And we're not going to read the whole thing, but you could go turn to Habakkuk chapter 1, and the whole chapter is basically about what God is doing that the prophet Habakkuk could not wrap his mind around. He could not get. He said, "How long will you let this injustice happen? How long will you let it happening?" God says, "I'm doing something in your days that you wouldn't believe." Habakkuk says, "Try me." God says, "I'm going to punish you guys with the Babylonians." And Habakkuk says, "You were right. No way. I cannot believe that. How are you, a holy God, going to use this unholy nation? This impure nation?" Esther pushes us even more into understanding God's providence because as you read through the book, you'll notice that Yahweh, God, I am, never mentioned. Not once. Not once in the entire 10-chapter book. Okay. A few more cross-references we could add. You could add Daniel 2:21 and also the cross-reference there to Daniel 4 that God is ruling through and in the lives of the kings. The kings like to think that they were the pens writing history, but what Scripture constantly reminds them of is even if they were, God was the hand using the pens. Now, in this study for Esther, I learned something that I'd never heard before, even though the name God is never explicitly used in the book of Esther. There are at least 4 verses with either alliterations or acrostics that spell Yahweh, okay, with Hebrew letters, which is neat, which is interesting, but it suggests something to us. I mean, there are scriptures with hidden things in them, okay? One being apocalyptic language, when the meaning is put behind a symbol. That way the message could be spread freely and people wouldn't get upset about it. Another one being parable, where sometimes Jesus speaks in parables so that those who would hate and take offense to what he'd have to say, well, they don't really get it. But here is not either one of those things. As you read through Esther, it's not parable. As you read through Esther, it's not apocalyptic to encode meaning. But the reason I think that these acrostics or alliterations were used were theological reasons. As we'll see, the place the book ends is the biggest nod to providence. The entire book is about providence. His name is not on the forefront, but hidden to say that everything that happens is God working something out. Okay, and I think by the end, hopefully, you'll see that. Let's look at a few of these cases of, well, let's talk through what happens in the book, and you'll see providence along the way. Esther chapter 1 explains the banquet of the king and how his wife, Queen Vashti, refused to come to him. She became not his wife, and then he looks for another. Okay, chapter 2, let's jump into verse 21. Okay, 2 and 21. In those days, while Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's officials from those who guarded the door, became angry and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. But the plot became known to Mordecai, and he told Queen Esther, and Esther informed the king in Mordecai's name. Now, two things important here, that the king holds a beauty contest. And Esther ends up there, and she's the most beautiful, and she wins the favor of all the people, and she wins the favor of the king, and she becomes the queen. No longer just Esther, or her Hebrew name, Hadassah, but Queen Esther. Her relationship to Mordecai is this. Mordecai is not her dad. Mordecai is not her father. Mordecai is her cousin because she was an orphan, had neither father nor mother, and Mordecai looked after her. Now, the verse that we just read in 2 chapter 21 is Mordecai happened to be standing at the gate, and he happened to overhear what the king's guard officials were going to do to him. And they became angry and sought to lay hands on him. We'll come back to this. Chapter 3 and in verse 8. Okay, you're introduced to a fourth character now. Okay, not just King Ahasuerus, not just Esther, not just Mordecai, but also Haman. Okay, Haman was a man of pride. Haman goes through and he wants everyone to bow to him, just like they were supposed to do, except one person doesn't, Mordecai. I'm going to read 3 and verse 8. Then Haman said to King Ahasuerus, there is a certain people, he doesn't say Jew, very important. There is a certain people scattered and dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from those of all other people, and they do not observe the king's laws, so it is not in the king's interest to let them remain. If it is pleasing to the king, let it be decreed that they be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who carry on the king's business to put in the king's treasuries. Now, Haman shows who he really is. He's kind of a snake. Haman doesn't tell the king who he's really talking about. He says, there's a certain people that I'll take care of. Okay, I'll give you these 10,000 talents of silver. I'll put it into the treasury if you let me take care of the problem. He never says that they're the Jews, and he never says, also the woman that you love, the queen that you just made queen, she's also one of these people. She's also one of the people that will die in all this. Now, in the next chapter, we're introduced back to Mordecai. I know we're going through a lot here, but just bear with me. Okay, we want to get through the text. In the next chapter, we're back to Mordecai, and Mordecai comes to Esther and says, don't think that this doesn't apply to you. Don't think it's not going to happen to you because you're in the palace. And then he says this in verse 14. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, and you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this? Or your version might say, or who knows if you haven't come to the kingdom for such a time as this? I think that's the key verse. If the text is about providence, this is the one. And the way that providence works is it's from God's perspective, God doing the work. For us, it's a perhaps. Who knows? Paul tells Onesimus something very similar. Okay? Perhaps that's why he was a runaway slave. Maybe. You're telling me you don't know Paul, an apostle? There are things that you don't know? Yes. But maybe this is what God is doing to work. Okay? Let's go to chapter 6 now. Esther chapter 6. Context, as we get to Esther chapter 6, know that Haman is building a gallows. And when you think about the Persian gallows, don't think about like a cowboy movie where there's like some wood and then there's like a rope hanging and then they put them in it and that's a good sound effect. Kick out whatever they're standing under. That's not what it was like. It was like a pole in the ground with a point on top that was 75 foot in the air. And so to be hung on the gallows means you're up top, skewered through it, and everybody sees. Everybody has to look at it. And everybody knows that whoever you are, whatever kind of people or whatever you've done, there's a lesson for the community from that. Now, Haman puts it there for his pride. He was going to put Mordecai on it just because Mordecai wouldn't bow. And then this happens. Esther chapter 6. During that night, the king could not sleep. This is the text showing us the providence of God. It doesn't say why. Why couldn't the king sleep? Who knows? The text doesn't say. Only this. The king couldn't sleep. And what did he do when he couldn't sleep? He said, well, I can't go to sleep. I'm kind of bored. Bring me the Chronicles. Let me read them. Let me see what's been going on in the kingdom. So he gave an order to bring the book of records, the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. It was found written that Mordecai had reported concerning Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs, who were doorkeepers, that they had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. The king said, what honor or dignity has been bestowed on Mordecai for this? Then the king's servants who attended him said, nothing has been done to him. Okay. So think about what happens. We read that all the way back in chapter 2, okay? And chapter 2 is when it actually happens. It happens that Mordecai hears the plot. He tells Esther. Esther lets it be known. Nothing happens to King Ahasuerus. But the king doesn't do anything about it yet. Except one night when he can't sleep, he happens to read. The thing that he happens to read is that book. And he says, what is the thing that I can do for this man? Now, in a movement of reversal, the text kind of gets really funny from here because it kind of hones in on the pride of Haman. Look at verse 3. The king said, what honor or dignity has been bestowed on Mordecai for this? Then the king's servants who attended him said, nothing has been done for him. So the king said, who is in the court? Now Haman had just entered the outer courts of the king's palace in order to speak to the king about hanging Mordecai on the gallows, which he had prepared for him. The king's servant said to him, behold, Haman is standing in the court. And the king said, let him come in. So Haman came in, and the king said to him, what is to be done for the man who the king desires to honor? And Haman thinks to himself, whom would the king desire to honor more than me? Then Haman said to the king, for the man whom the king desires to honor, let them bring a royal robe which the king has worn, and the horse on which the king has ridden, and on whose head a royal crown has been placed. And let the robe and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble princes. And let them array the man whom the king desires to honor, and lead him on horseback through the city square, and proclaim before him, thus it shall be done to the man whom the king desires to honor. I want to make it very clear what happens. He's in the outer court. That is, Haman is in the outer court. The king says, who's in the courts? I need to talk to somebody. It's Haman. Bring him in. Haman comes in, and the king says, King Ahasuerus, say there's somebody I want to honor. What do I do? Mordecai says, he's talking about me. What I would do, king, is I would let him play king. I would put him in your finest robe, put a crown on him, put him on your horse. And he says, that's exactly what I'll do. And then as you keep reading, he says, go get Mordecai and do it. Take it to the Jew Mordecai and do that thing. Do you see the irony and the subversion? The one who's prideful and upset, just like pride has been a lesson in the last two books, and subversion as well. The one who's prideful is Haman. The one who's humble, Mordecai. Mordecai raised at the hands of Haman. Okay. You could read verses 6 through 14, okay, to read the rest of that. We'll pause there. Okay. Now, turn to chapter 7, and I want to set in context chapter 7 by jumping around some of the things that we missed. And some of the things that we missed, when Esther promised to risk her life to go to the king, and it is risking her life because if you go to the king's courts without being answered, without being asked to come, there's a good chance he just puts you to death, okay? Unless he happens to put his scepter out, and then you're forgiven and you're allowed to talk. She goes into the court, unrequested. He looks at her, reaches his staff out, and he says, "What can I give you?" Anything. Up to half the kingdom I'll give you. And she says, "I'm not going to tell you yet. I'm going to make a feast and also bring Haman to the feast." Haman, the one that wants to kill all the Jews. So he says, fine. Okay, so they bring Haman to the feast, and this is the feast in chapter 7. Okay, now the king and Haman came to drink wine with Esther the queen. And the king said to Esther on the second day also as they drank their wine at the banquet, "What is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted to you. And what is your request? Even to half of the kingdom it shall be done." Then Queen Esther replied, "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and it pleases the king, let my life be given me as my petition, and my people as my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. Now if we had only been sold as slaves, men and women, I would have remained silent, for the trouble would not be commensurate with the annoyance to the king." Then King Ahasuerus asked Queen Esther, "Who is he and where is he? Who would presume to do this?" Okay, presumably all in anger. Esther said, "A foe and an enemy is the wicked Haman." Then Haman became terrified before the king and queen. The king arose in his anger from drinking wine and went into the palace garden. But Haman stayed to beg for his life from Queen Esther, for he saw that harm had been determined against him by the king. Now when the king returned from the palace garden into the place where they were drinking wine, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was. Then the king said, "Will he even assault the queen with me in the house?" As the word went out of the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Then Harbonah, one of the eunuchs, went before the king, said, "Behold, indeed, the gallows standing at Haman's house, 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke good on behalf of the king." And the king said, "Hang him on it." So they hanged Haman on the gallows, which he had prepared for Mordecai, and the king's anger subsided. Okay. Now, as you read through the rest of the text, Queen Esther remains queen. There's a Jew, one of God's tiny little oppressed remnant, in a place of royalty, being the queen. The second thing that happens towards the end of the book is that Mordecai is placed in a place of authority. He's given the king's signet ring. And that's very important, especially in their culture, especially in the Persian culture. Because if any command was made and stamped with the signet ring, then it couldn't be undone. Okay. One more thing worth mentioning. Look at Esther chapter 9. This is where we'll begin to close down. And read verse 24 with me. "For Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the adversary of all the Jews, had schemed against the Jews to destroy them, and had cast pur, that is, the lot, to disturb them and destroy them." It's very important, that word P-U-R in your English. He cast pur. It just simply means he cast lots. He cast lots, and the thought is to what day he was going to kill all the Jews. That was the thing that he cast lots for. Now, hold that in mind. We're almost to the point where it all clicks together, at least it did for me. Turn to Psalms with me. Okay. Nope, actually it's Proverbs. Proverbs 16. Proverbs 16. I just want to read one verse at the end of Proverbs 16. Verse verse 33. The lot is cast into the lap, but its every decision is from the Lord. Now, this is all going to stretch our mind a little bit because it's not generally how we think. Think all the way even to the New Testament, right? When they're deciding who is going to take Judas's place, they have a couple candidates. What do? Cast lots. Why do they cast lots? Well, Proverbs says it. The lot is cast, but it's the Lord who makes the decision. There's nothing random with God. God is the one that's always, always working. God is the one making things happen. And it's interesting that as Esther goes, Haman had cast lots to decide what would be the fate of the Jews. And instead of that being what happened, Haman ends up on his own gallows, and then the Jews celebrate a holiday every year. It's called Purim or Pur, or simply in our English, the holiday that the Jews got from this is called Lots. It's called Lots. Why? Because it's God's providence that delivered them through this entire ordeal where there could have been 0 Jews, and now they're in a place of authority. Who was behind all that? God. And guess what? His name wasn't even mentioned in the book. That's the providence of God. In all this, okay, we see the providence of God. We see the reversal that he makes happen. And we see that everything is on God's time. I want to end with reading Galatians 4:4. Okay. Galatians 4:4. Everything's on God's time. But when the fullness of time came, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, so that he might redeem those who were under the law, that we might receive the adoption as sons. All throughout history, God has never stopped working to bring about the perfect time to bring Jesus. The time when the message could be spread and would be spread, and the time when people would still be talking about it 2,000 years later in a building on the other side of the world. This morning, if you will trust in the God who's always working, if you see his providence has brought you to this point, to this room, to be with these people and hear this message. If you want to be in God's family, if you want to be immersed into Christ, if you need the prayers of the church, would you come as we stand and as we sing?